Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, we are doing a deep dive today into an absolutely fascinating body of research. It's heavily anchored by Thomas Gilovich's landmark book, How We Know What Isn't So.
Right, which is just a classic in this space.
It really is. And our mission here is to investigate the cognitive system of human belief formation. We're going to look really closely at how flawed pattern detection—
Which is something our brains do automatically all day.
Exactly. All day, every day. How that actually ends up shaping entire institutions, professional judgments, and public understanding.
Yeah.
So the core premise for you, the listener, to keep in the front of your mind as we navigate this is that people often think they see patterns in the world that simply aren't there.
Right. They see things that are just noise.
But when those patterns feel convincing enough, entire institutions can begin operating as if they were perfectly real.
Exactly. And to understand how these systems shape belief, we have to start by looking at the beliefs themselves. Gilovich sets up this entire exploration by pointing a spotlight at some incredibly common, incredibly stubborn beliefs.
Things people just accept as fact.
Totally. These are things that highly educated, deeply experienced people hold as absolute, unvarnished facts of everyday experience. But when you subject them to clinical research and rigorous data analysis, they simply are not true. They fall apart.
Let me lay out a few of these right at the top just to grab your attention, because the odds are very high that you listening right now believe at least one of these.
Oh, definitely.
First, let's look at the idea that infertile couples who adopt a child are subsequently more likely to conceive.
Such a common one.
You've probably heard this story. The narrative usually goes that the couple is incredibly stressed out by the process of trying to conceive. They finally give up, they adopt a child, the stress evaporates, they stop obsessing, and boom, the biological machinery relaxes and they get pregnant.
It makes perfect intuitive sense.
It really does. Except clinical research and massive demographic data sets show this just isn't true. Adopting does not magically increase a couple's biological fertility.
It's a beautiful story, but a statistical phantom.
Right.
Another fantastic example from the research involves college admissions, or really any kind of high-stakes corporate hiring.
Oh yeah, the interview illusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People charged with making these decisions almost universally believe that personal interviews—
Sitting across a desk from someone for 30 minutes.
Right, looking them in the eye. They think that's vastly superior to objective criteria for predicting future success. But decades of research into organizational psychology indicates that decisions based solely on objective criteria, test scores, past performance data, blinded portfolios—
The boring data.
The boring data, yeah. That data is at least as effective, and in many cases significantly more effective, than those influenced by the highly subjective, highly biased impressions formed during a brief interview.
And here is one of my absolute favorites because it involves highly trained medical professionals, maternity ward nurses.
Yes.
These are people who deliver babies for a living. They are on the front lines of human reproduction. And a massive percentage of them firmly believe that more babies are born when the moon is full.
They will absolutely swear to it.
They will tell you that the ward goes absolutely crazy on a full moon. But again, when researchers actually pull the historical birth records across decades and cross-reference them with lunar cycles—
It's completely flatline.
Completely flat. There is zero correlation. They are completely mistaken. So the massive, glaring question we have to answer today is, why do people so fiercely believe these things if they just ain't so?
That is the crux of the entire matter. And it's crucial to clarify right up front that holding these beliefs is not a matter of stupidity.
Right.
We're not talking about irrationality or gullibility or lack of education. It's actually a byproduct of what researchers call flawed rationality.
Flawed rationality. I like that phrase. It takes the judgment out of it.
Yeah. Precisely. You have to look at the evolutionary context here. The human mind has been optimized over hundreds of thousands of years for pattern detection in highly uncertain, often dangerous environments.
Sure, out on the savannah.
Right. It was not optimized for precise statistical accuracy. Recognizing patterns quickly, knowing that a certain rustle in the grass meant a predator, or a certain type of cloud meant a deadly storm.
That kept us alive.
Exactly. It helped our ancestors anticipate threats and survive. So our cognitive machinery is incredibly powerful, but it comes with a built-in bias. It prioritizes coherent stories, immediate causes, and visual patterns over ambiguous probability and statistical noise.
So we hold these beliefs because, based on the incomplete everyday data we encounter, they actually seem like the irresistible products of our own lived experience.
Yeah, our brains are working exactly as designed, but the design is fundamentally mismatched for evaluating complex statistical realities.
The human mind prefers coherent stories to ambiguous probability.
That is exactly right. And when you scale that up from an individual brain to an entire society, the outcomes are predictable. False beliefs persist even when evidence contradicts them. Random events become narratives.
Coincidences become causes.
Yes, and institutions adopt practices that appear rational locally but are built on misinterpreted signals.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the foundational bedrock of this entire phenomenon, something called the clustering illusion.
This is a big one.
To get into this, the source material brings up Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher who famously wrote, "Nature abhors a vacuum."
Right.
The argument here is that just as physical nature abhors a vacuum, human nature abhors a vacuum of unpredictability and meaninglessness.
We can't stand it.
We are completely biologically predisposed to see order, pattern, and meaning in the world around us. We find randomness and chaos to be deeply, psychologically unsatisfying.
What's fascinating here is that we cannot simply dismiss this tendency as a flaw because the evolutionary benefit of this exact trait is what built human civilization.
Right, it's not all bad.
Think about the history of science and medicine. Consider Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s.
The doctor who figured out hand washing.
Yes, but think about how he figured it out. He was working in a hospital in Vienna that had two maternity clinics. One was staffed by doctors and medical students, the other by midwives.
Okay.
Semmelweis detected a terrifying pattern. The mortality rate from childbed fever was astronomically higher in the clinics staffed by doctors. He observed the environment, seeking a pattern, and realized the doctors and students were often coming directly from the autopsy room to the delivery room without washing their hands.
Because germ theory wasn't a thing yet.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He spotted the invisible pattern of contamination before germ theory was even established. Spotting that pattern led to the practice of antisepsis and saved countless lives.
Or think about Charles Darwin. He visits the Galapagos Islands, and instead of just seeing a chaotic assortment of random birds, he sees a highly structured order in the distribution of different species of finches across different islands.
Right.
He connects the shape of their beaks to the specific food sources available in their immediate environment. His pattern-seeking brain cuts through the noise of nature and forms the foundational theory of natural selection.
Exactly. Recognizing patterns is highly adaptive. It leads to profound discovery. The structural flaw, however, is that this tendency operates on absolute overdrive.
It just doesn't turn off.
Our cognitive engine doesn't have an off switch, so we spot meaningful patterns even when only the vagaries of chance are operating. And worst of all, we treat the products of this cognitive overdrive not as hypotheses that need to be tested, but as established, unquestionable facts.
To make this super concrete for you listening, think about flipping a coin.
A classic example.
It's the simplest generator of randomness we have. The research explains that human beings have genuinely faulty, almost comically bad intuitions about what random chance sequences actually look like.
We really do.
Let's say I flip a coin 20 times. Because we know the overall probability is a 50-50 split between heads and tails, we expect that 50-50 split to appear locally.
Meaning, we expect the sequence to look highly alternating. Heads, tails, maybe two heads, then two tails.
Right. We expect it to look uniformly mixed.
Yeah.
But truly random sequences don't look like that at all. Truly random sequences are incredibly lumpy.
Lumpy is a great word for it.
If you flip a coin 20 times, the odds are actually quite high that you will get a streak of 4, 5, or even 6 heads in a row at some point in that sequence.
Yeah.
But when human beings see a streak of 5 heads, our brain immediately screams, "That's not random. That coin is rigged. There's a pattern."
We incorrectly expect the long-term law of averages to apply to short, local sequences.
Yes.
And this visual or pattern matching bias is everywhere. It is a fundamental feature of the human visual cortex. Think about how often you have looked at the pockmarked surface of the moon and clearly seen a human face.
We're seeing shapes in the clouds.
Exactly. We impose order on noise.
There's a brilliant analogy used to explain how stubborn this is. involving the St. Louis Gateway Arch.
Oh, this is a great one.
If you have ever seen a picture of the arch or stood in front of it, it looks significantly taller than it is wide. It looks like a soaring, stretched, vertical structure. It is essentially one of the world's largest architectural optical illusions.
It really is.
In reality, its exact height and the exact distance of its base at the ground are equal. It is 630 feet tall and 630 feet wide.
But here's the critical part, the part that explains human belief systems. Even when you are explicitly told the measurements are identical, even if you watch someone measure it with a laser, the illusion persists.
You can't unsee it.
You cannot overcome the visual illusion simply by possessing the correct data and taking another look.
Yeah.
The arch will always look taller than it is wide.
And our cognitive illusions regarding randomness and patterns work the exact same way, don't they?
They absolutely do. Even when we logically know a data set is generated by random chance, it still looks patterned to our brain. We can't turn off the perception of the pattern just by knowing the math.
Which brings us to one of the most entertaining but deeply illustrative arenas where this clustering illusion operates: the professional sports stage.
Yes.
This illusion isn't just a quirk. In sports, it is practically a religion.
What's fascinating here is the pervasive myth of the hot hand in basketball. Fans, players, coaches, and sports commentators almost universally believe that success breeds success on the court.
If you've ever watched a game, you've heard an announcer say someone has the hot hand.
Exactly. The central idea is that if a basketball player hits a few shots in a row, a psychological and physiological change occurs. They get relaxed, they feel supremely confident, their muscle memory locks in, they get into a groove or the zone, and suddenly they are far more likely to hit their next shot than they normally would be.
And on the flip side, if they miss a few sneaks, they go cold.
Right, they become tense, they overthink their mechanics, and they're significantly less likely to score.
It sounds completely reasonable. It aligns with everything we feel when we play a sport. But the research team wanted to know if this feeling actually translated into statistical reality.
So they did a study.
A massive, deeply rigorous study focusing on the Philadelphia 76ers during their 1980-1981 season. First, they established the baseline of belief. They surveyed knowledgeable basketball fans, and 91% of them stated that they firmly believed a player has a better chance of making a shot after having just made their last 2 or 3 shots.
It was essentially treated as an undeniable law of the game.
Totally. So the researchers painstakingly looked at the actual shot-by-shot records of the 76ers for the entire season. They analyzed thousands of data points to see if a player's hits cluster together more than you would expect by pure random chance.
They were asking if a player shoots 50% from the field overall, do their hits clump together into streaks of 4 and 5, followed by streaks of misses in a way that defies the normal mathematical lumpiness of a coin flip?
And the results were completely, totally contrary to everyone's expectations.
They really were.
The data revealed that a player's performance on a given shot was entirely statistically independent of their performance on previous shots. There were no more streaks of 4, 5, or 6 hits in a row than you would find streaks of heads when flipping a coin.
In fact, the data showed something even more counterintuitive. There was a very slight but measurable tendency for players to shoot better after missing their last shot and slightly worse after making their last shot.
Wait, let me stop you there because I know exactly what anyone listening who plays basketball is thinking.
The defense argument.
Yeah, I'll play devil's advocate here. Basketball is a dynamic game. It isn't a coin flip in a vacuum. If a player is feeling hot, the defense recognizes it. They double team him. They guard him closer.
Right.
And conversely, if the player feels hot, they might get overconfident and take much harder, lower percentage shots from further away. So couldn't those variables be masking the hot hand effect in the data? If they're taking harder shots under heavier defense, maybe they really are hot, but the difficulty balances out the stats.
That is the exact immediate pushback the researchers receive, and it is a perfectly valid scientific question. But the researchers anticipated it, and they controlled for it brilliantly.
What did they do?
They realized they needed a data set within the game of basketball that removed the defense entirely and kept the distance and difficulty identical every single time. So they looked at free throw data.
Ah, brilliant.
Exactly. They analyzed the free throw records of the Boston Celtics across 2 entire seasons. When a player steps to the line for 2 consecutive free throws, there is no defensive pressure. The distance is exactly 15 feet every single time.
The mechanics are isolated.
If the hot hand exists, if making a shot breeds the confidence and relaxation to make the next shot, it should absolutely show up in the second free throw.
And guess what? The outcomes of consecutive free throws are also completely independent. The researchers found that on average across the team, players made 75% of their second free throws after making their first one.
And they made 75% of their second free throws after missing their first one.
The outcome of the first shot had 0 predictive value for the outcome of the second shot. The hot hand simply did not exist in the data.
To put the final nail in the coffin, the researchers went a step further and tested the players' own internal perceptions.
I love this part.
They set up an experiment with college basketball players at Cornell University. They had them take 100 shots from a set distance. But before every single shot, the player had to place a high or low bet on whether they would make the next shot based on how confident they felt in that exact moment.
This experiment tests the psychological core of the myth.
Yes. And the results were stunning. The players absolutely believed they were shooting in streaks. Their betting behavior showed it perfectly. They consistently bet high after making a shot, feeling they were hot, and they bet low after a miss, feeling they were cold.
But when you correlated their bets with the actual outcome of the subsequent shot,
Absolutely no relationship. Zero correlation.
the players couldn't even predict their own success based on their own internal feelings of being in the zone. So how did the professional sports institution, the coaches, the managers, the people who literally make millions of dollars based on understanding this game, react to this rigorously proven, bulletproof data? This is the wild part. They completely, utterly rejected it.
Red Auerbach, the legendary multi-championship winning coach of the Boston Celtics, famously scoffed at the research. When presented with the data, he literally said, "Who is this guy?" So he makes a study. I couldn't care less.
Wow.
Bobby Knight, the fiercely competitive and famous Indiana University coach, dismissed the findings entirely by waving his hand and saying there are simply too many variables for a paper like this to mean anything to someone who actually understands the game.
Okay, but why? We can't just call them stubborn. We have to analyze why professionals at the absolute top of their field reject this data so vehemently.
It brings us right back to the clustering illusion and the St. Louis Arch. Think about what a coach is actually looking at when they watch a game. Because a truly random arrangement of hits and misses will contain lumpy streaks, the professionals are watching the game and they are genuinely visually seeing streaks of 4 or 5 hits in a row.
They aren't hallucinating.
No, they are not hallucinating the streaks. The streaks exist. Their fundamental mistake lies in misinterpreting that random statistical clustering as a causal force.
They see a cluster, and their pattern-seeking brain refuses to accept it as a coin flip.
Exactly. They invent a narrative. They use words like confidence, relaxation, momentum, and the zone to explain something that is simply the mathematical inevitability of chance.
Right.
And because they are so intimately close to the game, because they spend their lives immersed in it, the visual illusion is incredibly, overwhelmingly powerful. Just like looking at the St. Louis Arch, simply telling a coach the math behind the coin flip doesn't make the visual illusion of the hot hand go away. They trust their eyes over a spreadsheet.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if we zoom out from a basketball court, we have to speculate on how massive institutions double down on these illusions and what it costs them.
It has huge implications.
In basketball, players adjust their risk-taking based on feeling hot. They take wilder shots. They force the play, even though their internal feeling doesn't actually change their physical probability of making the shot. If professional coaches are making multi-million-dollar roster decisions or drawing up final second plays based on an optical illusion of data,
How does this exact same cognitive flaw affect a high-stakes industry like finance?
exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains an enormous amount of highly irrational behavior on Wall Street and in global financial markets.
Investors are essentially looking at coin flips.
Investors look at random, minute-by-minute fluctuations in stock prices, and they do the exact same thing the basketball fans do. A truly random series of market changes simply does not look random to the human eye.
Right. They see a line graph moving up and down.
Yes, and it looks to them like it contains enough coherence, enough momentum to predict future value. People see a stock go up 3 days in a row. and they subconsciously think the stock has a hot hand.
So they invent a causal narrative.
They do. They'll say, the company's new management strategy is really taking hold, or the market is finally realizing their value, to explain what might just be a random cluster of trading volume.
And based on that invented narrative, they invest real massive amounts of capital.
They are betting high after a hit, just like the college basketball players, completely unaware that the market's previous day is often completely independent of its next.
Which brings us perfectly into the next major concept of our deep dive: how we cement these misperceptions by creating meaning out of absolute noise.
This is where it gets a little scary.
If our brain sees a pattern, whether it's on a basketball court, a stock ticker, or in the sky, it doesn't just stop at noticing it. It doesn't just say,
Yeah.
oh, that's interesting. It immediately spins up an internal explanation module to justify and contextualize the pattern.
We need an answer.
The research shares an incredibly vivid, somewhat terrifying historical example of this from the Second Battle of London during World War II.
Yes, this is a very powerful, sobering illustration of how desperate the human brain is for order when faced with chaos.
Set the scene for us.
During the later stages of the war, the Germans began bombarding London with V-1 buzz bombs. These were essentially early cruise missiles, and they were terrifying. Now, the Londoners on the ground, the people huddling in shelters and observing the destruction day after day, widely asserted that the weapons appeared to be landing in definite targeted clusters.
From the ground, it didn't look random at all.
Exactly. To the terrified populace, it looked like certain specific areas of the city were being deliberately, precisely targeted, while other areas, sometimes just a few blocks away, were being intentionally spared.
You can imagine how meaningful those perceived clusters must have felt to the people living through that trauma.
A random death is terrifying. A targeted death at least has a reason. So the Londoners' pattern-seeking brains went into overdrive. They started developing elaborate theories to explain the clusters.
Like what kind of theories?
They theorized that there were German spies living in the spared neighborhoods, sending signals to the bombers. Or they believed there were highly specific, secret strategic targets being pinpointed in the destroyed areas.
But the research shows us a map of the actual bomb impacts. If you look at the historical data, they mapped out every single point of impact over central London. And the post-war statistical analysis of this spatial data reveals a completely different reality.
Entirely different.
When scientists analyzed the grid, they found that the dispersion of the V-1 bombs was actually completely mathematically random. The bombs fell in a classic Poisson distribution.
Which is a statistical model that perfectly describes the probability of a given number of events occurring in a fixed space or time if those events occur with a known constant mean rate and independently of the time since the last event.
In simpler terms, any given location in London was just as likely to be struck as any other location.
The German targeting accuracy was basically non-existent within that broad metropolitan area. The bombs just fell where they ran out of fuel. The clusters and the spared neighborhoods were nothing more than the inevitable lumpiness of a random distribution across a large geographic area.
But wait, I'm looking at the book's breakdown of this, and it points out something crucial about how human beings look at data retrospectively. This is the trap.
Yes, this is the core of the error. If you take that exact map of London with the random bomb impacts, and you intentionally draw lines bisecting it vertically and horizontally in a very specific subjective way, you can manipulate the visual data.
You can force a pattern.
You can draw a grid that creates 4 quadrants where the upper left and lower right quadrants happen to capture an abundance of bomb hits, and the other 2 quadrants capture a dearth of hits.
So you are basically moving the target lines to capture the clusters that already exist by chance.
Precisely. And if you run a basic statistical test on just that specific hand-drawn carving of the map, the clustering actually looks mathematically significant. It appears to depart from chance.
But a properly trained scientist, a statistician, knows you cannot do that. You cannot build a statistical analysis retrospectively around the most anomalous features of the data.
It's totally flawed methodology.
The analogy I always hear is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You can't shoot 100 arrows at the side of a barn, walk up to the cluster where 3 arrows randomly hit close together, paint a bullseye around them, and declare yourself an expert marksman.
Exactly. To a rigorous scientist, an apparent anomaly or a cluster in one specific set of data merely suggests a hypothesis. That hypothesis must then be locked in and tested against a completely new, independent set of data.
But the intuitive assessments of the average person, the everyday judgments we all make, are not bound by these scientific constraints.
We shoot the arrow, paint the bullseye, and congratulate ourselves on our keen perception.
We do. We form a hypothesis based on a set of chaotic results, and then we deeply consider that hypothesis proven by those very same results. We selectively peruse data in hindsight, we make entirely too much of apparent anomalies, and we detect profound order where absolutely none exists.
And the systems implication of this, how it shapes our society, is profound. It creates a literal crisis in perception.
The human understanding supposes a greater degree of order than it actually finds in nature.
We don't just see a random cluster of bombs, we invent a complex story about a network of German spies. And the research notes that we do this with incredibly complex, high-stakes issues today.
Think about public policy. We see a complex societal effect, like a sudden, localized spike in crime rates, or a massive, unpredictable ecological change, and our brain desperately wants to attribute it to a simple, singular, immediate cause.
It satisfies our deep psychological need for narrative coherence.
So we construct elaborate sociological theories or political narratives to explain what might, in reality, just be random statistical variance, or the output of incredibly complex, multifaceted systems that defy simple explanation.
This tendency to invent causal narratives for statistical variance perfectly sets up what I think is one of the most consequential, behavior-altering cognitive traps we are discussing today.
The regression fallacy.
Yes. This whole concept is based on a fundamental statistical principle called regression to the mean.
Okay, let's unpack this, because regression to the mean can sound like dry, academic jargon, but it silently dictates so much of our lives, our businesses, and our relationships.
It's everywhere.
The easiest way to think about it is that exceptional events are, by definition, exceptions. They require a perfect storm of variables to align. Because it is rare for all those variables to align perfectly twice in a row, the next event will likely be less exceptional.
A classic historical example goes back to Francis Galton in the 19th century, measuring the heights of parents and children.
What did he find?
If a father is exceptionally extremely tall, say 7 feet tall, his son is likely to be taller than average because of genetics. But the son is mathematically highly likely to be closer to the average height than the father.
He will probably not be 7 feet tall.
Exactly. The extreme height regresses toward the mean of the population. Similarly, if a company has an absolute banner year of profits, an extreme historic high driven by a perfect alignment of market conditions, great management, and pure luck,
The very next year is mathematically likely to be closer to their historical average. It'll be less extreme.
The research gives a fantastic pop culture example of how our failure to understand this leads to magical thinking. The Sports Illustrated jinx.
Right. For decades, many professional athletes firmly believed that being featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated magazine was a literal curse.
They genuinely believed that the act of being on the cover somehow spelled doom for their subsequent performance.
They would point to countless examples of athletes having a terrible season right after their cover issue hit the stands.
Right.
But let me push back here as the devil's advocate.
Go for it.
Isn't it entirely possible that the immense, suddenly national pressure of being on the cover of the most famous sports magazine in the world causes real psychological choking? Doesn't the spotlight distract them, making them change their routine? Is it really 100% just mathematical regression?
That is a very sophisticated question. Is it possible that media pressure introduces a new psychological variable? Yes, absolutely. Psychological pressure is real, but statistical regression is mathematical and it is inescapable. We have to ask, why does an athlete get on the cover of Sports Illustrated in the first place?
Because they just did something amazing.
Exactly. Because they have just achieved an extraordinarily peak performance. They have reached a statistical extreme value. They hit 70 home runs or won 10 games in a row.
And due to the immutable laws of regression to the mean, their subsequent performances are almost mathematically guaranteed to be less extraordinary.
They haven't necessarily been jinxed by the magazine. Their performance is just naturally regressing toward their own long-term average baseline. The peak cannot be sustained indefinitely.
But because human beings don't naturally perceive statistical regression, we don't intuitively feel the math. We invent a causal narrative. We blame the physical magazine cover. We create a superstition.
And the research highlights an even more crucial, deeply real-world cost of this fallacy. It isn't just about athletes and magazines. It's what we might call the teaching and parenting trap.
This is where regression to the mean actually shapes human behavior and institutional policy in a slightly tragic way.
This raises an incredibly important question about how we, as a society, use reward and punishment. Clinical psychologists and behavioral scientists have known for a very long time that rewarding desirable behavior is generally much more effective for long-term learning and motivation than punishing undesirable behavior.
Positive reinforcement builds habits. Negative reinforcement often just builds avoidance and resentment.
But for many parents, teachers, and corporate managers, their everyday lived experience seems to directly contradict this psychological fact. They genuinely deeply feel that punishment works better and faster.
Why? Because they're being fooled by regression to the mean.
Exactly.
Let me walk through exactly how this happens, because when I first read this, it completely blew my mind and changed how I view management. Imagine a student in a classroom or an employee at a company who normally performs at a solid average level. One day, they turn in an absolutely brilliant peak performance.
An extreme high.
The teacher or the manager does the right thing. They praise them, giving them a reward or public recognition.
But because that brilliant performance was an extreme peak, regression to the mean dictates that their very next performance will likely be somewhat worse. It will slide back closer to their normal average.
Right. So to the teacher or the manager observing this, what does it look like? They applied praise, and the next day the performance dropped. It looks like the reward was completely ineffective, or worse, that the praise caused the student to get lazy and slack off.
Now consider the exact flip side of this scenario. That same average student has a terrible day. They turn in an extremely poor performance, an absolute disaster.
It's an extreme low.
The teacher or manager gets angry. They yell, they apply strict punishment, they dress them down.
Because that terrible performance was an extreme statistical low, regression dictates that their next performance is almost mathematically guaranteed to be better, closer to their average baseline. It has nowhere to go but up.
Exactly. So the teacher sees a bad performance, applies harsh punishment, and sees immediate, tangible improvement the very next day. From their limited perspective, it looks like the punishment was incredibly, unequivocally effective.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can suddenly see how entire massive institutions, public school systems, massive corporate HR departments, even the criminal justice system, can adopt practices built entirely on this specific mathematical misinterpretation.
Regression effects artificially mask the true effectiveness of reward, making praise look useless. And simultaneously, regression spuriously boosts the apparent effectiveness of punishment, making anger and penalties look like magic bullets.
The tragedy is that authority figures lean heavily into punitive measures, genuinely and sincerely believing they work better based on the evidence of their own eyes. They're not being malicious, they're being systematically tricked by their data environment. They are punishing people for statistical inevitabilities.
Which is a perfect segue into the next major theme of this entire complex structure, the information trap.
Specifically, we need to talk about confirmation bias and the concept of hidden data. Because the question often arises, especially when we look at these systemic failures, why do highly intelligent, rigorously educated people sincerely believe things that are simply not supported by objective evidence?
And the fundamental answer is that the data environment we live in is an absolute mess. Real-world data doesn't come neatly packaged in a spreadsheet. It is incomplete, it is incredibly noisy, and it is highly ambiguous.
Let's return to the adoption and fertility myth we mentioned right in the intro. You hear a story at a dinner party about a couple who tried for 5 grueling years to have a baby.
They undergo IVF, they suffer, they finally give up.
They adopt a beautiful child, and then, miraculously, 3 months later, the wife gets pregnant. It is a fantastic, emotionally resonant story. It's a tearjerker. Our attention is naturally drawn to it. The research calls this focusing on the confirming instances, the times the two specific events, adoption and conception, intersect.
But by hyper-focusing on that one emotionally satisfying narrative, we completely ignore the hidden data. And this is where we must introduce one of the most vital critical thinking tools in cognitive science, the 2x2 matrix.
Yes, the 4 cells of data. This is crucial.
When we are evaluating any causal belief, like adoption increases fertility, we cannot just look at the success stories. We must rigorously look at 4 distinct cells of data to see if a real correlation exists.
Yep.
Cell number 1, couples who adopt and subsequently conceive. That's the dinner party story.
Cell number 2, couples who adopt and do not conceive.
Cell number 3, couples who do not adopt but conceive anyway. And finally, cell number 4, couples who do not adopt and do not conceive.
To truly understand if a real mathematical relationship exists between adoption and fertility, you have to analyze the ratios across all 4 of those cells.
Exactly. But everyday life does not serve up all 4 cells. Life mostly only serves up cell 1. The other 3 cells are hidden or absent from our casual observation.
We rarely notice couples who adopt and never conceive because it's not a dramatic, miraculous story. Nobody gossips about the status quo. So our brains build a rule based on a fraction of the necessary data.
The research applies this exact concept of hidden or absent data to how colleges run admissions or how major corporations handle hiring. Decision makers in these roles often confidently believe that their interview processes, their specific questions, and their selection criteria work perfectly.
And why wouldn't they? They look around their company or their campus and they see successful people.
But think about the geometry of this data trap. If a highly selective college only admits students who score exceptionally well on a specific standardized test, and most of those admitted students go on to graduate and succeed in life, the admissions officers will pat themselves on the back and conclude the test is a flawless predictor of human success.
But they are entirely missing the crucial hidden data. How would the rejected students have performed?
Right. What if you let the kids with low scores in? Would they fail?
Exactly. Without allowing the rejected group to attempt the coursework, there is absolutely no way to truly scientifically evaluate the efficacy of the selection test.
If the baseline rate of success is generally high for anyone motivated enough to apply to that college, the rejected students might have succeeded just as well. But because they're locked out by the system, the decision makers are completely shielded from their own potential errors.
They live in what psychologists call an illusion of validity, constantly congratulating themselves based on artificially restricted data.
And this creates incredibly powerful, real-world, self-fulfilling prophecies. The research uses a great everyday example that I think everyone can relate to.
Say you meet someone at a party, and based on a brief, awkward interaction, you get the initial impression that they're unfriendly or aloof. What do?
You avoid them.
Exactly. You steer clear. You don't invite them to coffee. You don't strike up a second conversation. But by actively avoiding them based on your initial assumption, you deny them any opportunity to disconfirm your belief.
They literally cannot prove you wrong because you won't let them near you.
The subsequent absence of friendliness from them, which is actually caused by your avoidance, is then construed by your brain as further proof of their inherent unfriendliness.
It creates a deeply asymmetrical data environment. People quickly establish what the research calls an insufficient threshold of what constitutes adequate support for a belief. If we find 1 or 2 confirming instances, our brain says, case closed, and we stop looking for new data.
This leads directly to the Lake Wobegon effect, where we constantly, subconsciously seek out information that confirms our own hypotheses, and we happily, blindly ignore the rest.
This mechanism allows us to maintain a totally unjustified confidence in our own judgments, even when we are entirely wrong.
Which leads right into how we handle the data we do actually see. It's not just about the data that's hidden from us. It's about how our brains actively distort the information that is right in front of our eyes.
The research dives deeply into how we see what we expect to see and, crucially, what we want to see.
Our pre-existing expectations heavily bias how we evaluate ambiguous data.
It is a profound cognitive trade-off. To process the massive, overwhelming amount of sensory and social information we face every single day, we have to use our pre-existing beliefs, our stereotypes, and our generic knowledge to quickly extract meaning. This mental shortcut makes us fast and efficient.
We don't have to reevaluate what a chair is every time we see one.
But the massive cost of this efficiency is that we do not weigh all facts equally. When we encounter information that neatly supports our pre-existing beliefs, we give it a free pass. We accept it at face value without a second thought.
But if a piece of evidence contradicts our beliefs,
suddenly we become hypercritical scientists. We subject it to intense microscopic scrutiny, actively looking for any tiny flaw or excuse to discount it.
the research highlights an incredible, brilliantly designed study about this involving black uniforms in professional sports. Researchers wanted to know if the cultural association of the color black with aggression or badness, think of Darth Vader, or the bad cowboys in old westerns wearing black hats, actually altered perception in a high-stakes environment.
So they showed a group of highly trained professional referees a videotape of a football scrimmage.
And here's the genius of the methodology. Half the referees saw the aggressive, attacking team wearing white uniforms. The other half saw the exact same play, the exact same movements. But the video was meticulously altered, so the aggressive team was wearing black uniforms.
The results perfectly, chillingly illustrate biased evaluation. The professional referees who watched the black uniformed version of the video rated the play as significantly more aggressive and much more deserving of a formal penalty than the referees watching the white uniforms.
They literally saw a different reality. They saw what the cultural expectation led them to expect to see.
And this isn't just a lab trick. This translates to the real world. When you analyze the penalty data across decades, teams wearing black uniforms in the NFL and the NHL are statistically penalized far more often than teams wearing other colors. The psychological expectation alters the literal visual perception of the physical event.
The research also explores how these biased expectations create the illusion of patterns in our everyday lives. It explains why we so firmly believe things like, the phone always rings the exact moment I step into the shower, or it always rains the day after I wash my car.
These are what cognitive psychologists call one-sided events.
This is a crucial distinction to understand. What is the difference between a one-sided and a two-sided event?
A two-sided event is an event that registers in your memory regardless of how it turns out. Both outcomes are memorable. For example, if you bet $100 on a football game, you will clearly remember if you win the bet, and you will clearly remember if you lose the bet. Both sides of the event stand out emotionally.
But a one-sided event only registers in your memory when it specifically confirms your expectation or causes an interruption.
Right. If the phone rings while you are covered in soap in the shower, it's incredibly annoying. It disrupts your routine. You notice it, you curse, and you vividly remember it.
Exactly. But think about the hidden data. How many times have you taken a shower and the phone didn't ring?
Hundreds of times. Thousands.
But you don't notice those times. Taking a peaceful shower doesn't register as a memorable event.
So over time, your memory bank is filled entirely with the confirming instances, the annoying interruptions. You are left with a highly biased mental sample, leading you to genuinely, sincerely believe in a magical pattern of the universe conspiring against your clean car or your quiet shower, when in reality, the pattern doesn't exist.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because it's not just about what we passively expect to see. It's about what we actively want to be true. The research analyzes the deep difference in how human beings process desirable information versus undesirable information.
When we encounter evidence for something we want to believe, say a study showing that eating chocolate makes you live longer, or a political poll showing our preferred candidate is winning, the internal subconscious question we ask ourselves is, can I believe this?
That phrasing is essential. Can I believe this? We are just looking for a bare minimum standard of plausibility.
If the study looks somewhat official, if we can find just one loosely credible piece of confirming evidence, we gladly accept it as absolute truth and move on.
But when we encounter evidence for something we don't want to believe, a study showing our bad habits are killing us, or data proving our political ideology is flawed, the standard of evidence changes dramatically. The internal question instantly shifts from, can I believe this, to, must I believe this?
We demand absolute, mathematically irrefutable, flawless proof before we will begrudgingly accept an unpalatable truth. We will attack the methodology of the study, the funding source, the character of the researchers.
It is a completely asymmetrical burden of proof, driven entirely by our internal emotional motivations.
And the danger is that we rarely realize our inferential process is biased. We genuinely think we are being objective and rigorous, while secretly, subconsciously stacking the deck entirely in favor of our desired conclusions.
So if we take a step back, we have all these individual internalized cognitive biases. We have the clustering illusion making us see patterns in noise. We have our blindness to regression to the mean. We have the trap of hidden data, and we have our emotionally biased evaluation of evidence. How do these individual, localized mental quirks become massive, society-wide false beliefs? How do they infect entire institutions?
That is what the research addresses in the analysis of the social echo chamber. It explains how false beliefs essentially go viral.
And it happens primarily through the transmission of secondhand information and a powerful sociological phenomenon called the false consensus effect.
We have to rely heavily on secondhand information, news, gossip, textbooks, documentaries, because we simply cannot physically experience everything in the world ourselves. We must trust others.
But secondhand information is inherently structurally distorted.
When human beings tell stories, even when they are trying to be honest, they naturally simplify them. They emphasize the dramatic, salient points, and they omit the boring, mundane, qualifying details in order to make the story more entertaining and digestible. We constantly grant each other this literary license in an everyday conversation.
But the research points out that the media ecosystem does this exact same thing, on a massive industrial scale. Because the economic demand for highly entertaining, shocking news vastly outstrips the actual supply of truly novel, scientifically verified facts, the media often stretches the truth. They give massive, uncritical airtime to psychic detectives, miracle cures, or UFO sightings because it drives engagement.
The book discusses a specific television program from a few decades ago called Project UFO.
This is a perfect example of structural media distortion.
This program would spend 59 minutes of a one-hour broadcast, vividly depicting dramatic spaceships, terrifying alien visitations, and mysterious abductions. It was highly produced, emotionally gripping entertainment.
Then, for a mere 2 seconds, quite literally during the fast-scrolling end credits, they flashed a tiny disclaimer text stating that all the UFO sightings depicted had actually been thoroughly investigated by the military and completely explained away as weather balloons or atmospheric anomalies.
But the damage is already done. The viewers were left with the profound, lingering, emotional impression of extraterrestrial visitation because the entertainment value was massively amplified for an hour, while the factual, boring correction was essentially hidden in the fine print.
Exactly. And this media amplification feeds directly into the false consensus effect. This is the deeply ingrained psychological tendency for people to vastly overestimate the extent to which other people share their exact beliefs, preferences, and attitudes. We naturally project our own mindsets onto the broader public.
The research describes a famous, slightly hilarious experiment conducted on a university campus to prove this. Researchers asked college students to walk around the busy campus for 30 minutes wearing a large, embarrassing sandwich board sign that just said, "Repenti" in huge letters.
I love the sheer awkwardness of this experiment. So the researchers present this task. Some students, the bolder ones, agreed to wear the sign, and some, understandably, flat out refused. But then the researchers asked every student, regardless of their choice, to estimate what percentage of their fellow peers would also agree to wear the sign.
The students who agreed to wear it estimated that a solid majority, 60% of their peers, would also do it. It felt like a normal, fun thing to do.
But the students who refused to wear it, they thought that only 27% of their peers would be crazy enough to agree. Both groups forcefully projected their own personal choice onto the unseen majority.
What's fascinating here is analyzing the social mechanism driving this false consensus. Why do we constantly think everyone secretly agrees with us? Primarily because we selectively associate with people who are exactly like us. It's the echo chamber.
Liberals hang out with liberals, conservatives with conservatives, athletes hang out with athletes.
We curate our social media feeds. We are constantly exposed to a highly biased, self-selected sample of the population. Furthermore, when we do occasionally encounter someone with radically different beliefs in an everyday setting, social norms dictate that we rarely challenge them openly.
Right. If you are at a polite dinner party and someone says something you mildly disagree with, you don't usually start a screaming debate. You nod, you smile politely,
Yeah.
you feign agreement to avoid conflict and keep the social interaction pleasant.
Exactly. And what does that polite nodding do? It creates a massive society-wide false sense of social support. Because our disagreements remain hidden beneath of the veneer of politeness, our flawed beliefs are rarely subjected to healthy, rigorous scrutiny or debate.
We look around, see everyone nodding, and we think our unverified, quirky, or completely false beliefs are actually mainstream and highly sensible. We feel socially validated, making our false beliefs incredibly rigid and deeply resistant to logic or contrary evidence.
Which brings us to the final and arguably most important phase of this deep dive, the profound, tangible damage these systems of misperception cause in the real world.
This isn't just about harmless superstitions like knocking on wood or wearing a lucky jersey. These cognitive traps, when scaled up to the institutional level, have severe, life-altering costs in health, science, and personal well-being.
The research transitions into analyzing this real-world impact by looking deeply at the tragic, often hidden consequences within the realm of alternative medicine and faith healing.
Yes. The text examines prominent figures like Catherine Kuhlman, who for decades conducted massive, stadium-filling faith healing services. Kuhlman, and healers like her, would claim to miraculously cure maladies.
But when you look closely at the data, the cures almost exclusively involve highly ambiguous, invisible maladies, things like chronic back pain, bursitis, migraines, or psychosomatic hearing loss.
These are conditions where the psychological placebo effect is exceptionally strong and where symptoms naturally wax and wane over time.
As the research pointedly notes, quoting a skeptical visitor to the healing shrines of Lourdes, you never see a pile of discarded artificial limbs or glass eyes left behind at these shrines. Faith healers never miraculously cure severed spinal cords, they don't regrow amputated limbs, and they don't reverse Down syndrome.
They operate purely in the murky realm of ambiguous criteria, where natural remission and temporary psychological relief can be easily mistaken by a desperate person for a divine miracle.
And the true heartbreaking tragedy here, as the author explores, isn't just that people are being sold false hope. It is the underlying, deeply toxic belief system that must be maintained to support the healer. The system requires the belief that disease is primarily caused by negative mental states, a lack of faith, or spiritual inadequacy.
So when an alternative healing cure inevitably fails, when the cancer spreads or the pain returns, who gets the blame?
The patient.
Yes, the patient is blamed. The healer doesn't say, my magic didn't work. They say, you didn't have enough faith, or you didn't visualize your healing hard enough, or you have arrested spiritual development blocking the cure.
As the author notes, what can be more fundamentally cruel than adding the heavy, crushing burden of spiritual self-recrimination to a victim's already devastating physical illness?
These systems of misperception allow charlatans to profit immensely while leaving the sick to torment themselves, wondering what personal moral failing brought on their disease.
It is a devastating misapplication of pattern detection. Another massive area where we see incredible institutional investment based entirely on flawed pattern detection is the widespread belief in ESP, extrasensory perception.
The research takes a very deep, critical dive into the famous Targ-Puthoff remote viewing experiments.
Yeah.
These were conducted in the 1970s at SRI International, the Stanford Research Institute.
This wasn't some fringe basement operation. This was a major, respected research facility, often funded by the government. At the time, the results of these experiments were published in the highly prestigious scientific journal Nature, and they were breathlessly touted by the global media as definitive, bedrock, scientifically proven proof of psychic human abilities.
The setup of these experiments was seemingly rigorous. A percipient, the person claiming psychic ability, would sit in an isolated, sealed room in a lab. Meanwhile, a team would physically travel to a randomly selected remote location somewhere in the surrounding area, say a specific bridge or a park.
The psychic in the lab would then try to mentally view the location and dictate a transcript of their psychic impressions. Later, a panel of independent judges would be given the transcripts and asked to match them to the list of targeted locations.
And their success rate was staggeringly, impossibly high. It departed so far from chance that it looked like undeniable mathematical proof of ESP.
Okay, let's unpack this methodology because the fatal flaw they eventually found is absolutely staggering, and it perfectly illustrates the blindness of confirmation bias even in trained scientists. When independent psychologists later scrutinized the methodology of the SRI experiments, the grand illusion completely unraveled.
The independent judges weren't just given the pure, isolated psychic descriptions of the physical locations. They were given the raw, unedited transcripts from the psychic sessions. And those unedited transcripts contained massive amounts of extraneous conversational material, including the psychic mentioning the specific dates, the times of day, and referencing previously visited sites.
The transcripts effectively had chronological markers baked right into them. The psychic might say, well, yesterday at the park I saw this, but today I'm seeing water.
Exactly. So the judges didn't need to use the psychic descriptions at all. They could just act as basic detectives, piecing together the timeline and the dates to figure out which location matched which transcript in sequence.
They were solving a chronological logic puzzle, not validating psychic visions. It wasn't magic. It was incredibly sloppy, highly compromised methodology that was eagerly mistaken for a supernatural pattern.
When researchers later meticulously removed all the chronological clues and just left the physical descriptions, the judges' matching success plummeted exactly to the baseline of random chance. The ESP effect completely, totally vanished.
This powerful example illustrates how even highly trained scientists operating in prestigious institutions can fall prey to confirmation bias and the clustering illusion if they aren't absolutely ruthlessly rigorous with their experimental controls. They wanted to see a pattern, so they overlooked the fatal flaw that created it.
But these cognitive traps don't just affect grand scientific experiments or faith healers. They affect us on a deeply personal, intimate level, constantly altering how we navigate our own daily lives and careers. The research concludes this section by discussing a widespread psychological phenomenon called self-handicapping.
I see this constantly. Once you know what it is, you see it everywhere. The text opens this concept with a highly relatable dialogue between two amateur tennis players. Before the match even begins, before they even hit a warm-up ball, one player starts loudly complaining about a tweaked knee, mentioning they haven't had full mobility for a week, or that they slept on their shoulder wrong.
Or think about a high-pressure college campus. The research mentions the phenomenon of sneaky bookers. These are the highly competitive students who loudly complain to everyone that they haven't studied at all, that they were out partying right before sitting down to take a massive final exam.
This raises an important question about how human beings manage their own psychological risks and protect their fragile egos. Self-handicapping is a subconscious defensive strategy where we intentionally, actively create visible external obstacles to our own success.
We do this in order to carefully manage the attributions that other people, and more importantly, we ourselves, will make about our ultimate performance.
Think about the tennis player. If they lose the match, it's not because they lack skill or talent, it's simply because of the bad knee. The core ego remains perfectly protected, and if they somehow manage to miraculously win the match, despite the loudly advertised bad knee, they look like an absolute heroic genius.
It's a win-win for the ego. So I have to ask you, listening right now, how many times have you done this? How many times have you created a built-in excuse before a big presentation at work saying you didn't have enough time to prep? Or before a social event, saying you're feeling a bit under the weather just in case the interaction goes wrong?
We engineer these situations constantly because we are deeply existentially terrified of an unambiguous failure, a failure that can only be attributed to our own lack of ability.
But the tragedy of self-handicapping is that by constantly providing ourselves with these comforting excuses, we deny ourselves the crucial opportunity to learn from our true mistakes. And we horribly bias the internal data we use to honestly evaluate our own competence. We build a false narrative of our own lives.
Exactly. We trap ourselves in an illusion of our own making. So understanding all of this, the clustering illusion, the failure to recognize regression to the mean, the danger of hidden data, biased evaluation, the social echo chamber, and ego protection, what can we actually do about it?
The research is very clear that simply understanding this cognitive architecture does not magically eliminate human error. We are still biologically, evolutionarily wired to seek patterns. We can't turn the machine off.
But understanding it deeply helps clarify why we believe what we believe. And more importantly, it provides us with better, sharper tools for clearer vision.
The final section of this entire exploration is all about correcting the system. How do we fix, or at least mitigate, this flawed rationality? The author suggests that we cannot rely on intuition. We need to actively, consciously adopt the rigorous mental habits of the probabilistic sciences. We need to learn how to evaluate everyday evidence like a disciplined scientist.
And the ultimate, most practical tool against the clustering illusion and confirmation bias is incredibly simple to remember, but requires immense discipline to apply. Whenever you are faced with a compelling pattern, a new theory, or a deeply held belief, you must stop your brain from jumping to a conclusion and always ask, what do the other three cells look like?
We have to return to that 2x2 matrix. Let's use one final powerful example from the research regarding the belief in answered prayers. If someone prays intensely for a specific outcome, and their prayer is answered, they naturally emotionally note that instance as profound proof of a benevolent system listening to them. That is one cell of the matrix, the confirming cell.
But to truly rigorously evaluate the efficacy of the action, you have to actively force your brain to seek out the hidden data. What about the times you pray with equal intensity and the prayer is not answered? That's cell 2.
What about the times you completely don't pray and you get exactly what you want anyway through random chance? That's cell 3.
And what about the times you don't pray and don't get what you want? That's cell 4.
Because our human brains naturally lazily only focus on the first cell, the dramatic confirming instance, we must exert deliberate conscious effort to look for the other three. We have to constantly recognize that our daily lived experience is serving us a highly biased, incomplete sample of information.
But we have to learn to step back, acknowledge the vast amount of statistical noise in the data of our lives, and demand a fuller, more complete picture before we let a convincing narrative solidify into an absolute, unshakable belief.
So what does this all mean for us as we navigate the world? It means we are fundamentally pattern-seeking animals, desperately trying to navigate a universe filled with statistical noise and complex probability. Our intuition is a beautiful, powerful tool for survival, but it is fundamentally structurally flawed when dealing with the realities of randomness and data.
To avoid this crisis in perception, we have to recognize the severe limits of our own lived experience. We have to actively challenge the comforting stories our brains constantly invent to make sense of the chaos.
It leads to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with, something to deeply mull over long after you finish listening to this deep dive.
If our brains are biologically hardwired to detect patterns in order to keep us safe, but those very same pattern detecting mechanisms continually create the vast illusions and false beliefs that divide our society, maybe the most dangerous thing in the modern world isn't a lack of information or simple ignorance.
Maybe it's the absolute unyielding certainty that we are seeing the world exactly as it is. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.